When nature goes quiet, it's not always peace, it's a warning. Across the globe, from frozen lakes to jungle caverns, a pattern hides beneath the official stories. Torn camps, missing limbs, and witnesses who speak of something huge, upright, and silent. Authorities call them bears, cats, or freak accidents. But too many survivors describe the same impossible shape, shaggy, tall, and watching. These aren't just campfire tales. They're the echoes of something real that punishes trespass. These 6 terrifying encounters map a trail, from Vietnam's cave lakes to Montana's forgotten shores. Grimwater Lake sat nestled in the remote wilderness of northern Montana, 43 miles from the nearest paved road and surrounded by towering granite cliffs that cast long shadows across its pristine waters. In 2025, the glacial basin remained protected under federal law as part of a critical wildlife corridor, with access strictly forbidden to prevent disruption of migrating elk herds and endangered grizzly bear populations. The lake earned its name from early trappers who claimed the water had an unusual metallic taste, although modern testing revealed nothing more than typical mineral deposits from centuries of snowmelt runoff. On the morning of June 5, 2025, Cody Bramwell decided the risk was worth the reward. The 44-year-old construction worker from Stone Ridge had heard rumors from fellow anglers about the massive lake trout that supposedly thrived in Grimwater Lake's untouched depths. Federal restrictions meant these fish had never faced a hook, growing to legendary proportions, according to whispered conversations in tackle shops across the region. Bramwell convinced his cousin Trent Haley to join him for what he called a once-in-a-lifetime fishing expedition. The two men hiked through dense pine forest for 6 hours, carrying their gear in silence to avoid detection by any patrolling rangers. Bramwell had studied satellite images for weeks, identifying the most promising fishing spots along the lake's eastern shore, where deep water met rocky ledges. Haley, normally cautious about breaking rules, had been swayed by his cousin's enthusiasm and the promise of fish that could feed their families for months. They reached the lake just after dawn, when morning mist still hung low over the water like a gray blanket. Bramwell immediately began assembling his rod, while Haley scouted for the best vantage points. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional splash of jumping fish and the distant call of a loon. Bramwell cast his line with practiced precision, using heavy tackle designed for large lake trout, while Haley worked on setting up their small camp about 30 yards inland. For 3 hours, they enjoyed remarkable success. Bramwell pulled in 4 substantial trout, each weighing between 12 and 15 pounds, while Haley managed to land 2 smaller but still impressive fish. The illegal nature of their presence seemed almost forgotten as they marveled at the pristine environment and abundant wildlife. Bramwell joked that they should have brought a bigger cooler, while Haley took photographs of their catch against the dramatic backdrop of granite cliffs. Around mid-morning, Haley announced he needed to relieve himself and walked into the forest, following a game trail that led away from the water. He estimated he was gone for perhaps 10 minutes, stopping to observe a family of deer that seemed remarkably unafraid of human presence. When he returned to the shoreline, expecting to find his cousin still fishing, he discovered a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Bramwell's fishing rod lay snapped in half near the water's edge, the reel partially buried in muddy sand. His tackle box had been thrown open, with lures and sinkers scattered across a gruesome area as if hurled by tremendous force. Most disturbing were Bramwell's waders, still containing his boots, sitting upright about 15 feet from where he had been fishing. The rubber material was torn, but the boots remained perfectly positioned as if someone had simply stepped out of them. There was no sign of Bramwell anywhere. Haley called out for his cousin, thinking perhaps Bramwell had fallen into the water and managed to swim to safety somewhere along the shoreline. His voice echoed off the cliffs without response. As he moved closer to examine the scene, he noticed deep gouges in the muddy bank that looked like drag marks, leading from the water's edge directly into the dense forest. The impressions were unlike anything he had seen before, too large and deep to have been made by a bear, yet showing signs of something being pulled rather than walking. Following the drag marks for about 50 yards, Haley discovered torn pieces of Bramwell's jacket hanging from low branches. The fabric was shredded, as if by massive claws. He found more evidence of a struggle, including broken branches high above the ground and scattered debris that suggested panic and force. But no body, no tracks beyond a certain point, just silence and the overwhelming sense that something had watched them both. The trail eventually disappeared into a rocky area where tracking became impossible. Haley spent the next 2 hours frantically searching before hiking out to contact the authorities. A full search and rescue operation was launched within 6 hours, involving teams of rangers, tracking dogs, and helicopter surveillance. Despite 3 days of intensive searching, Bramwell was never found. The case remained open, filed under missing in wilderness, with no conclusive evidence pointing to foul play or natural accident. The official report concluded that Bramwell had likely been attacked by a mountain lion. Despite the unusual circumstances, rangers noted that several large cats had been spotted in the area during recent months, and the remote location made such encounters more probable. They theorized that Bramwell might have startled a cat while it was feeding, leading to a confrontation. However, Haley maintained a different account of events. He told investigators that just before discovering the scene, he had glimpsed a large figure moving through the trees near the shoreline. The shape appeared to be walking upright on 2 legs and was covered in dark hair from head to foot. He estimated its height at over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that swung as it moved. The creature had vanished into the forest before he could get a clear view, but Haley remained convinced that whatever happened to his cousin was not the work of a mountain lion. Haley never returned to the outdoors after that day. He sold all his fishing gear and avoided the topic entirely, except with close family. When pressed, he would only say that some places weren't meant to be visited, and that if nature keeps a secret, it's best to leave it alone. Devil's Tarn lay hidden deep within the Blackthorn Mountains, a dark pool of water surrounded by ancient peat bogs that had remained undisturbed for centuries. The remote mountain lake sat at an elevation of nearly 2,000 feet, accessible only by treacherous hiking trails that wound through restricted peatland zones, protected by national environmental authorities. Local folklore claimed the tarn was cursed, named for the strange mists that rose from its surface even on clear days, and the unsettling silence that seemed to blanket the entire area. In 1988, the national government had designated the surrounding region as a protected habitat for rare bog plants and migrating birds, making any human activity within a 3-mile radius strictly illegal. Warning signs posted at various trailheads clearly stated the penalties for trespassing, which included substantial fines and possible imprisonment. Despite these restrictions, stories persisted among local anglers about the massive brown trout that supposedly inhabited Devil's Tarn, fish that had grown to extraordinary sizes in the absence of fishing pressure. Darren Quigley, a 31-year-old mechanic from a nearby city, had become obsessed with these stories after hearing them repeated in pubs throughout the surrounding countryside. He spent months researching the area, studying topographical maps and questioning older fishermen who claimed to have visited the Tarn decades earlier, before the restrictions were implemented. Quigley became convinced that a single successful fishing trip to Devil's Tarn could provide enough trophy fish to establish his reputation among urban anglers. On a foggy morning in early September 1988, Quigley convinced his friend Colin Finnegan to accompany him on what he described as an adventure that would make fishing history. Finnegan, a cautious accountant who rarely broke even minor regulations, was reluctant but eventually agreed after Quigley promised to handle all the legal consequences if they were caught. The 2 men loaded their gear before dawn and drove to a remote parking area several miles from the restricted zone. The hike to Devil's Tarn proved more challenging than Quigley had anticipated. The terrain was boggy and treacherous, with hidden pools of standing water that could easily trap an unwary traveler. Finnegan carried the heavier supplies while Quigley navigated using a compass and a hand-drawn map based on descriptions from elderly fishermen. They encountered no other hikers during the 4-hour journey, which took them through increasingly wild and desolate landscapes. Quigley reached the tarn first, arriving nearly 30 minutes ahead of his companion due to his eagerness and faster pace. When Finnegan finally crested the final ridge, breathing heavily from the difficult climb, he expected to find his friend already fishing from the rocky shoreline. Instead, he discovered a scene that would forever change his relationship with the outdoors. Quigley's expensive fishing rod lay broken in 3 pieces near the water's edge. The graphite shaft snapped as if it had been subjected to tremendous force. His tackle box had been driven into the soft peat with such violence that it was embedded nearly 6 inches deep. The metal corners bent and twisted beyond recognition. Most disturbing was the eerie silence and sense of violent disruption at the scene, with no sign of Quigley nearby. Finnegan called out repeatedly for his friend, his voice echoing strangely across the still water. The silence that followed felt oppressive and unnatural, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. He searched the immediate area frantically, looking for any sign of where Quigley might have gone. About 20 yards from the shoreline, he found his friend's jacket hanging from a stunted hawthorn tree, torn and stained with something dark. The trail of destruction led inland from the tarn, marked by broken branches and disturbed peat. Finnegan followed these signs for several hundred yards before losing the trail in a rocky area where tracking became impossible. During his search, he discovered several footprints in soft ground that appeared far too large to have been made by any human. The impressions were nearly 18 inches long and showed clear toe marks, but the depth suggested something much heavier than a person. Finnegan hiked out immediately and contacted local authorities, who launched a comprehensive search operation the following day. Teams of Gardaí and volunteer searchers combed the area for 3 days without finding any trace of Quigley beyond the evidence Finnegan had already discovered. No remains were ever found. The official investigation concluded that Quigley had likely been attacked by a wild animal, possibly part of a feral pack that occasionally roamed the remote mountain areas. Authorities theorized that the victim had been dragged away from the initial scene, which explained the lack of further evidence. The case was officially closed after 2 weeks, with Quigley declared missing and presumed dead due to an animal encounter. However, Finnegan provided a different account to Father McKenna at his local parish, seeking spiritual guidance for what he had witnessed. He told the priest that just before discovering the scene, he had observed a large figure moving through the mist near the opposite shore of the tarn. The shape had been walking upright on 2 legs and appeared to be covered in dark fur or hair from head to foot. Most unsettling was the complete silence of its movement, despite its obvious size and weight. Father McKenna advised Finnegan to keep these details private, suggesting that some experiences were better left unexplained. The traumatized accountant never returned to the mountains again, selling all his outdoor equipment and refusing to discuss hiking or fishing with anyone. He moved to another region within 6 months and avoided visiting the Blackthorn Mountains for the remainder of his life. Kolopo Lake remained one of Indonesia's best-kept secrets, hidden deep within the dense jungle of Arwana province on the island of Taksaka. The pristine body of water sat within the boundaries of Kirana National Park, a protected area established in 1992 to preserve the last remaining habitat of the critically endangered forest rhinoceros. Access to the lake required special permits from environmental authorities, and even scientific research teams faced months of bureaucratic approval before being allowed entry. The surrounding rainforest teemed with wildlife that had remained largely undisturbed by human activity for decades. In 2012, the lake gained attention due to reports of massive giant gourami populations that had developed in the absence of commercial harvesting, prompting concerns about illegal fishing operations. These prized food fish could sell for substantial sums in urban markets, making the risk of operating within protected boundaries financially attractive to desperate fishermen facing declining catches in legal waters. Authorities had increased patrols around the park's perimeter, but the vast wilderness made complete enforcement nearly impossible. Arman Sahid, a 43-year-old fisherman from the coastal village of Labuan, had been struggling to support his family as traditional fishing grounds became increasingly depleted. He had heard rumors from other fishermen about the untapped resources of Kolopo Lake, where giant gourami supposedly grew to sizes unseen in commercial waters. After weeks of careful planning, Saheed decided to organize an illegal expedition that could provide enough income to sustain his family for several months. Saheed recruited Rio Tambak, a local guide who claimed extensive knowledge of the jungle trails leading to the protected lake. Tambak had previously worked with research teams before park restrictions became more stringent, and he maintained detailed knowledge of the safest routes through the dense rainforest. The two men agreed to split any profits from their illegal fishing operation, with Tambak receiving a smaller share in exchange for his guidance and local expertise. They departed Labuan before dawn on a humid morning in late March 2012, traveling by motorcycle to a remote trailhead several hours inland. The journey to Kolopo Lake required a full day of hiking through challenging terrain, including river crossings and steep climbs through thick vegetation. Tambak led the way while Saheed carried specialized fishing equipment designed for capturing large gourami, including nets, traps, and portable holding containers. The lake appeared even more pristine than the rumors had suggested, with crystal clear water surrounded by towering trees that formed a natural cathedral of green canopy. Fish were clearly visible near the surface, including several gourami specimens that appeared to exceed 3 feet in length. Saheed immediately began preparing his equipment, while Tambak positioned their small inflatable canoe for quick evacuation if park rangers appeared. Working under the cover of darkness, Saheed waded into the shallow areas near the shoreline to set his specialized traps designed to capture gourami without harming them. The plan was to keep the fish alive in portable containers, ensuring they reached urban markets in optimal condition. Tambak remained in the canoe, monitoring the surrounding forest for any signs of approaching authorities and maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. Within the first hour, Saheed had successfully captured 2 large gourami and was working to set additional traps in deeper water. He reported his success to Tambak using hand signals, indicating that their illegal operation was exceeding expectations. The guide remained alert but relaxed as his partner continued working methodically along the shoreline, moving from one promising location to another. Around midnight, Tambak heard his partner scream from somewhere near the far end of the lake. The sound was brief but filled with terror, cutting through the jungle silence like a knife before ending abruptly. Tambak immediately began paddling toward the source of the scream, calling out quietly for Saheed while trying to locate his position using a small flashlight. When Tambak reached the area where he believed the scream had originated, he found Saheed's equipment scattered across the muddy bank. The fishing nets were torn and tangled in nearby vegetation, while the portable containers lay crushed and empty on the ground. Most disturbing was Saheed's headlamp, which continued spinning in the dirt, casting rotating beams of light across the disturbed ground. Following the obvious signs of struggle, Tambak discovered a trail of crushed reeds and broken branches leading directly into the dense forest. The path of destruction was remarkably wide, suggesting something much larger than a human had passed through the area. He followed the trail for several hundred yards before losing it in rocky terrain, calling out desperately for his missing partner. Tambak spent the remainder of the night searching frantically before hiking out at first light to contact authorities. A team of park rangers launched an immediate search operation, focusing on the possibility that Saheed had been attacked by one of the native predators known to inhabit the region. After 2 days of intensive searching, they discovered several pieces of Saheed's equipment scattered across a wide area. No sign of his body was ever found. The official investigation concluded that Saheed had likely encountered a dangerous animal, possibly defending territory near the lake. Rangers noted that such encounters were rare, but not unprecedented in areas where humans encroached on protected wildlife habitat. They theorized that the fisherman may have fled or become disoriented during the encounter, which would explain his disappearance. However, Tambak provided park officials with details that contradicted the animal encounter theory. He reported that during his search for Saheed, he had observed a large, upright figure watching him from the forest edge approximately 50 yards away. The creature appeared to be standing on 2 legs and was covered in dark hair, with a height he estimated at over 8 feet. What unsettled him most was the intelligence in the creature's gaze, calculated and deliberate, not the instinctive fear or curiosity of a wild animal. The traumatic experience effectively ended Tambak's career as a jungle guide. He returned to his village and refused all requests for guiding services, claiming that some areas of the forest were meant to remain undisturbed by human activity. When questioned by other fishermen about profitable locations within the national park, he would only warn them that certain places harbored dangers that no one fully understood, and some perhaps weren't meant to. Hollow Basin, nestled high in the Skelter Ridge of southern Africa, a pristine mountain lake surrounded by towering basalt cliffs that rise nearly 3,000 feet above sea level. The remote location had been designated as a restricted wildlife breeding zone in 1991, specifically to protect the endangered Maluti minnow and several species of highland frogs found nowhere else on Earth. Access to the site required special permits from the National Conservation Authority, and even legitimate researchers faced lengthy approval processes before being allowed to study the unique ecosystem. The basin itself was formed by ancient volcanic activity, creating a natural amphitheater where mountain streams converged to form a deep, cold lake. Indigenous communities had long considered the area sacred, calling it Umgodi Wokubulala, or the Hollow of Death, due to strange disappearances that occurred there over the centuries. By 1994, government restrictions had made the lake virtually inaccessible to the general public, though rumors persisted among local anglers about the massive rainbow trout that supposedly thrived in its untouched waters. Marius Venter, a 36-year-old electrician from Red Spire, had become obsessed with reaching Hollow Basin after hearing stories from his grandfather, who claimed to have fished there during the 1960s before restrictions were implemented. The older man described trout of extraordinary size, specimens that had grown fat and lazy in the absence of fishing pressure. Venter spent months planning an illegal expedition, studying satellite images and questioning elderly locals who might remember the old hiking routes. Venter convinced his friend Jacques Moller to join him on what he described as the fishing trip of a lifetime. Moller, a cautious insurance agent who rarely broke rules, was reluctant, but eventually agreed after Venter promised to handle any legal consequences they might face. The two men loaded their gear in Venter's pickup truck and drove to a remote farm road that provided the closest vehicle access to the mountain trails. The hike to Hollow Basin proved more grueling than either man had anticipated. The terrain was rocky and steep, with altitude changes that left both men breathing heavily, despite their relatively good fitness levels. They encountered no other hikers during the 8-hour journey, which took them through an increasingly wild landscape populated by baboon troops and occasional antelopes. The isolation was both exhilarating and slightly unnerving. They reached the basin just before sunset, when golden light illuminated the towering cliffs and revealed the pristine lake stretching before them. Fish were clearly visible rising to feed on insects near the surface, including several trout that appeared to exceed the size of anything either man had seen in legal waters. Venter immediately began assembling his rod, while Moller set up their small camp about 50 yards from the shoreline. For the first 2 hours of fishing, their illegal expedition exceeded all expectations. Venter landed 4 rainbow trout, each weighing between 8 and 12 pounds, while Moller managed to catch 2 smaller but still impressive fish. They marveled at the pristine condition of their catch and joked about the reaction their trophy photos would generate among fellow anglers back home. Around 9 in the evening, as darkness began settling over the basin, Moller was working to land his largest fish of the day when he heard heavy movement in the forest above them. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced in the southern highlands, too deliberate and powerful to be made by any known animal in the region. He called out to Venter, who was fishing from rocks about 30 yards away, but received no response. When Moller looked toward his friend's position, he saw only an empty fishing spot, with Venter's rod lying abandoned on the rocks. The expensive reel was still spinning, suggesting that Venter had been in the middle of fighting a fish when something interrupted him. Moller called out repeatedly while making his way toward the abandoned equipment, growing increasingly concerned about the sudden silence. As he approached Venter's fishing position, Moller discovered signs of a disturbance. The tackle box lay crushed against the rocks, its contents scattered across a wide area. Shreds of fabric were caught on nearby stones, but there was no sign of his friend. Following unclear, drag-like impressions that led from the fishing spot into the dense forest, Mueller found Venter's cooler about 40 yards inland. The insulated container had been completely flattened, as if crushed by something possessing tremendous strength. The fish they had caught remained inside, untouched, but compressed, along with the ruined cooler. During his frantic search for his missing friend, Mueller heard what he later described as the most terrifying sound of his life. From somewhere high above him in the cliffs came a deep, growling noise that seemed to echo off the surrounding rock walls. The sound was unlike any animal vocalization he had heard, too low and resonant to come from a leopard or other known predator. Mueller spent the entire night searching desperately for Venter before hiking out at first light to contact authorities. A full search and rescue operation was launched within hours, involving teams from the Mountain Rescue Service and National Conservation Patrols. Search dogs were brought in to follow scent trails, while helicopter crews scanned the vast wilderness from above. After a week of intensive searching, authorities were unable to locate Venter or any definitive trace of his whereabouts. The official investigation concluded that he had likely suffered a fatal accident, despite several unusual aspects of the case. Rangers noted that predator attacks in the area were exceedingly rare, and the lack of a body left many questions unanswered. The case was closed after authorities determined that no further investigation was warranted. However, Mueller provided investigators with details that contradicted the prevailing theory. He reported that the growling sound he heard had come from directly above his position, at a height where no large predator could have been present. The rocky cliffs were essentially vertical and offered no suitable habitat. He also described seeing a massive shadow moving along the cliff face during his search, something that appeared far too large to be any known animal. The traumatic experience fundamentally changed Mueller's relationship with the outdoors. He began drinking heavily within weeks of returning home and eventually required professional counseling to deal with what he had witnessed. When pressed by friends about the details of the incident, he would only say that some places harbored dangers that were better left undisturbed by human activity. Lake Sinai lay hidden in the remote highlands of the Kuroki Range, a chain of volcanic peaks stretching between Russia and Japan, remaining largely uninhabited due to harsh weather and treacherous terrain. The high-altitude lake sat at nearly 4,000 feet elevation, accessible only during brief summer months when snow cleared from the mountain passes. Russian authorities had designated the area as a protected salmon spawning ground in 1998, making all fishing activities strictly illegal during the critical breeding season from June through September. The lake's isolation and protection had created ideal conditions for Pacific salmon populations to recover from decades of commercial overfishing. Local poachers from Velinovsk were aware that successful illegal harvesting operations could yield substantial profits, as premium salmon commanded high prices in overseas markets. The risk of prosecution was offset by the remote location and minimal enforcement presence in the region. In July 2001, 3 experienced poachers from Velinovsk decided to set up a temporary camp at Lake Sinai during the peak spawning season. Pavel Chekhov, a 42-year-old former commercial fisherman, led the operation along with his partners Dmitry Volkov and Sergei Petrov. All 3 men had extensive experience in illegal fishing operations and understood the risks involved in working within protected areas. The team transported their equipment by helicopter to a landing zone several miles from the lake, then hiked through challenging mountain terrain, carrying specialized nets designed for salmon harvesting. They established a well-concealed camp on the southern shore, hidden among dense stands of dwarf pine that provided cover from any aerial surveillance. Their plan was to operate for 1 week before evacuating, having caught enough salmon to make the expedition financially worthwhile. For the first 3 days, their illegal operation proceeded without incident. The salmon runs exceeded expectations, with thousands of fish migrating through the lake during their spawning season. Chekhov maintained regular radio contact with his wife back in Velinovsk, reporting on their progress and estimated return date. His final transmission came at 8:17 on July 15th, when he reported that they had secured a substantial haul and would begin evacuation procedures the following morning. When the team failed to arrive at their scheduled helicopter pickup point 2 days later, concerned family members initiated search operations. A hiking party discovered their camp the following day, finding a scene that suggested sudden and violent disruption. All 3 tents had been slashed open from the outside, with equipment scattered across a wide area around the campsite. Most puzzling was the condition of their salmon catch, which remained completely untouched despite the obvious chaos. Hundreds of pounds of processed fish lay in their portable coolers, undisturbed and perfectly preserved by the mountain cold. This detail contradicted theories about bear attacks, as any such predator would have been primarily interested in the abundant food source. Search teams later found signs of a struggle near the shoreline, including personal belongings identified as Chekhov's, but no bodies were recovered. Authorities concluded that the men had likely fled the camp under duress, possibly separated in the rugged terrain. The other 2 men were never found, despite extensive searching by regional emergency services and military personnel. Helicopter crews scanned thousands of square miles of wilderness without discovering any additional remains or evidence of their fate. Ground teams followed various trails leading away from the lake, but lost all traces in the rocky terrain that characterized the volcanic landscape. Russian authorities officially classified the incident as a bear attack, noting that both brown bears and other large predators occasionally inhabited the region during summer months. The isolated location and abundant salmon populations would naturally attract such animals, making human-wildlife encounters a recognized hazard for anyone operating illegally in the area. However, several aspects of the case contradicted the bear attack theory. The systematic destruction of the campsite suggested deliberate rather than instinctive behavior, while the complete avoidance of the salmon catch seemed inconsistent with typical bear feeding patterns. Local indigenous peoples from nearby regions provided unofficial statements suggesting that certain areas harbored creatures unknown to modern science. Following the incident, Lake Sinai gained an ominous reputation among both legal researchers and illegal operators. Scientists who had previously conducted legitimate studies in the area began requesting transfers to other locations, citing unexplained equipment failures and disturbing encounters with unidentified wildlife. Even experienced poachers began avoiding the entire region, claiming that the potential profits were not worth the unknown risks. The lake remains effectively abandoned today, with no legal research operations and no reported illegal activities since 2001. Regional environmental authorities maintain their protection of the salmon spawning grounds, though enforcement has become unnecessary due to the area's reputation among those who might otherwise consider illegal fishing operations. Chekhov's widow received his final radio transmission as the last confirmed human contact from Lake Sinai. She reported that her husband's voice had sounded tense during that final communication, and she has since spoken of troubling dreams and a persistent sense that something was watching him during those final days. The recording was never made available to investigators, and she refused to discuss the contents with anyone outside her immediate family. The limestone cave systems of Nam Tai Basin in central Vietnam contain some of the most pristine underground waterways in Southeast Asia, carved over millions of years by the persistent flow of water through ancient rock formations. In 1979, the area remained largely unexplored by modern science, although local communities had long been aware of the hidden lakes that existed deep within the cave networks. These underground bodies of water harbored unique species of blind cave fish that had evolved in complete darkness, developing specialized adaptations found nowhere else on Earth. Following the end of the Vietnam War, black market trade had flourished throughout the region as desperate communities sought alternative sources of income. Rare cave fish commanded substantial prices among collectors in Saigon and other major cities, where they were prized for their unusual appearance and supposed medicinal properties. Local authorities lacked both the resources and the inclination to protect remote cave systems, making them vulnerable to illegal harvesting operations. Tui Vang, a 34-year-old former soldier from Dong Hoi, had heard rumors about caves containing valuable fish species that could be harvested without competition from other poachers. The war had left him with limited economic opportunities, and he desperately needed income to support his family during the difficult post-war period. After weeks of gathering information from local sources, Vang identified a specific cave system that was supposedly home to the most valuable specimens. Vang recruited Bao Nguyen, a fellow veteran who possessed diving experience from his military service, to join him in exploring the underwater caves. Nguyen had initially been reluctant to participate in illegal activities, but eventually agreed after Vang promised that the operation would be brief and highly profitable. The two men acquired diving equipment through illicit channels and carefully planned their expedition to evade detection by local authorities. They entered the cave system before dawn on a humid September morning in 1979, carrying portable lights and specialized nets designed to capture cave fish without damaging them. The initial cave passages were dry and relatively easy to navigate, leading steadily downward through increasingly narrow limestone corridors. After approximately 2 hours of careful progress, they reached the hidden lake that local informants had described. The underground lake stretched beyond the range of their flashlights, with crystal clear water that revealed remarkable depth despite the complete absence of natural light. Blind cave fish were immediately visible, swimming near the surface, including several species that neither man had seen before. Vang estimated they could capture enough valuable specimens within a few hours to make their illegal expedition extremely profitable. Nguyen remained near the cave entrance to serve as a lookout, while Vang prepared his diving equipment for underwater harvesting. The plan was for Vang to work systematically along the underwater rock formations, where cave fish typically gathered, using specialized nets to capture them alive for transport to market. Nguyen would monitor the cave entrance and assist with equipment as needed. Vang entered the water slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the underwater environment, which was illuminated only by his waterproof flashlight. The cave fish showed no fear of human presence, having never encountered such predators in their isolated ecosystem. Within 30 minutes, he had successfully captured a dozen rare specimens and stored them in a portable holding container designed to keep them alive during transport. As Vang worked deeper into the cave lake, Nguyen heard his partner's voice calling out from somewhere in the darkness, though the words were unclear due to echo effects within the limestone chamber. The calls continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly, leaving only the sound of gently lapping water against the cave walls. When Nguyen called out for his partner, he received no response from the lake area. He waited for nearly an hour before becoming concerned enough to investigate, though his limited diving ability made underwater search difficult. Using a spare flashlight, he could see Vang's waterproof light floating on the lake surface, but no sign of his partner anywhere in the visible water. During his search around the lake perimeter, Nguyen heard what he later described as footsteps moving across the water surface. The sound was impossible to explain, as nothing should have been capable of walking on the lake without creating visible disturbance. The footsteps seemed to circle his position before disappearing into the deeper recesses of the cave system. Nguyen spent the remainder of the night searching frantically before deciding to exit the cave and seek help from local authorities. However, his involvement in illegal poaching activities complicated his ability to report the incident officially. Instead, he contacted Vang's family and organized an informal search party to return to the cave system. Despite several days of searching, no trace of Vang was ever found. His equipment, nets, and flashlight were eventually recovered, but the man himself had vanished without explanation. Local authorities attributed the disappearance to a possible drowning or collapse within the cave structure. The official report speculated that an underwater current or unstable rock formation could have sealed off an interior chamber. One member of the informal search team later reported hearing strange vibrations in the walls during their exploration, a low humming that seemed to pulse in response to movement. Though dismissed as natural acoustics by others, the witness insisted it felt like a warning, as if the cave itself were alive and aware of their intrusion. This account was quietly omitted from the final summary of the incident. However, Nguyen provided family members with details that contradicted the official theories. He reported that the footsteps he heard exhibited a clear bipedal rhythm, moving with deliberate purpose rather than the irregular gait typically associated with a reptilian predator. He also noted that the water disturbance patterns he observed were inconsistent with those caused by natural processes. The traumatic experience convinced Nguyen to leave Vietnam permanently within 6 months of the incident. He eventually settled in France and rarely discussed his military service or post-war experiences with anyone. When questioned by his son years later about his time in Vietnam, Nguyen would only say that some places contained watchers that were better left undisturbed by human activity.